The Germans believed that France was stronger and more prepared for war than Russia, so the plan was to defeat them while Russia was still mobilizing and unprepared. They went with the old Schlieffen plan that was developed by General von Schlieffen after the Franco-Prussian War. The plan called for a swift invasion of Belgium and the Netherlands to go around the Maginot Line, so the German army didn't have to face the French army head-on in well-fortified areas. But General von Moltke went with a slightly altered Schlieffen plan, where they only invaded Belgium due to the Netherlands being useful for trade and the army high command not deeming the Netherlands as vital for the success of the plan. The Germans won quite a few battles in the beginning and reached territories deep into France, even nearing Paris, but they left some gaps in the front line, which meant they had to retreat and reorganize, and with that, Germany lost its momentum. Both sides reinforced their positions and the war turned into the brutal trench warfare that came to define the Western Front. The British reinforcements were vital in stopping the German momentum at that point, and without them, it's quite possible the Germans could have regained initiative and pushed the French over the river Seine and even take Paris. But that's not the scenario. In this video we're imagining a German empire that respects Belgian neutrality. But because Germany doesn't invade Belgium, Britain would not have joined the war, at least initially. The official reason for Britain joining the war was to come to the aid of neutral Belgium that was illegally invaded by Germany. Breaching Belgian neutrality may not seem like that big of a deal to join a war against the strongest land power in the world, and to be fair, it wasn't that big of a deal. The truth is that British politicians were looking for any reason that could have convinced Parliament to join the war against Germany, because in their eyes it was their last chance to curb rising German domination over the continent, and even globally should they defeat both France and Russia. The Royal Navy was already being mobilized even before Germany had even declared war on France. One interesting exchange that happened during the diplomatic crisis in the days leading up to the war was a message the Kaiser received from the German ambassador in London, where he was told Britain only guaranteed French independence and that if France wasn't invaded, Britain would not join the war. The Kaiser sent a telegram to King George agreeing to those terms, believing Anglo-German peace was set in stone under these conditions. He ordered the entire army to the east, despite Army High Command objections that this was no longer possible, since the bulk of the army was already on its way to the west. However, the Kaiser followed through, and it was decided to cancel the planned invasion of Luxembourg. Once mobilization was complete, the army would redeploy to the east. There was one slight problem, however, and that is that there was never a proposal from the British to keep out of the war if France wasn't invaded. As a response to the Germans agreeing to a proposal that didn't exist, the confused king sent a telegram to the Kaiser, informing him there must have been some kind of misunderstanding. When the Kaiser learned of this, he told General von Moltke to cancel the new plans and invade Luxembourg as was originally planned. This is where the timelines diverge. In this alternate scenario, the Kaiser doesn't react to the king's telegram and instead assumes there was a miscommunication between British politicians and royalty, and not a misunderstanding between Germany and Britain. The confident Kaiser doesn't try to figure out what the king meant with his message, and instead informs the Reichstag and generals of the agreement. Despite the agreement being a misunderstanding, the Kaiser would still have been proven right in that Britain would not have joined the war without the invasion of Belgium, even with war-hungry politicians like Churchill threatening to resign over British neutrality. Parliament needed to be convinced first, and without any clear escalation by Germany, it would have probably taken at least until 1916 before they voted in favor of joining the war. Without Britain joining the war right from the beginning, it would not have become as much of a world war as in our timeline. The two kinda great powers of Italy and the Ottoman Empire both joined because of Britain, but for different reasons. Italy looked favorably on Germany but disliked Austria and kept out of the war until they were promised land in Austria, and it looked like the Entente was the strongest faction. Without Britain, Italy would have stayed neutral, as there's no way they are assured of easy expansion by either side. The Ottomans were weakened by the Balkan Wars and thus not very eager to join, but they were basically tricked into fighting Russia by a German admiral and crew aboard 2 Ottoman ships that attacked Russia in the Black Sea, but they stayed in the war in the hopes of reconquering Egypt and the Caucasus. The attack was likely carried out by the admiral on his own volition. It will likely still occur, but the Germans have now bet on Britain not joining the war, so they would try to not antagonize them and solve this incident diplomatically, like taking responsibility for the attack and as well as pressuring the Ottomans to not join the war, which the Ottomans would gladly accept due to the lack of incentive they had without Egypt as a prize. Then there is little Bulgaria, that had been at war since gaining their independence, gaining and losing land for over 60 years. Their goal was to occupy all lands with a majority Bulgarian population, upsetting Serbia and Greece, which led to the Second Balkan War that they lost, ending up with small Bulgaria. Nothing really changes here. Bulgaria was still happy to join the war to get their beloved Macedonia and subsequently defeating Serbia. Greece is a little harder to predict because they were split in a pro-Entente and pro-Central Power faction, with their king being pro-German. They had all the land from Bulgaria that they wanted, but they joined the Entente to get territory in Anatolia with a sizable Greek population. This time, they won't be promised Ottoman land, and there isn't anything to gain in the Balkans. It could go 2 ways. They either join the Central Powers due to their good ties to Germany and to be on the good side in case of a Central Power victory, or stay neutral. Staying neutral has the benefit of not losing French and British economic aid and investment. Either way, they won't change the outcome of this scenario. Romania, the 3rd minor power, besides Portugal, China and Japan that did literally nothing. Romania had 2 regions they really wanted, Transylvania in Austria-Hungary and Bessarabia in Russia. And somehow, by the blessing of the Lord or Romanian diplomatic supremacy, they got both. They got defeated on the battlefield twice and somehow gained both land from their enemy and from their ally. Unfortunately, Greater Romania can't happen in this timeline, but they would likely join the Central Powers and still get Bessarabia, including the major port city of Odessa that has a big Ukrainian population they can Romanify. Germany continues its mobilization and moves 75% of their army to the east, leaving only 25% behind to defend against France, essentially the reverse of the Schlieffen Plan. It should be noted that such an abrupt change of plans would not have been a problem for the German army, due to the Prussian way of warfare established by von Moltke the Elder, but it was assumed that no plan will survive contact with the enemy, meaning the plans were flexible and not overly detailed. Eventually though, the Germans would have learned about their misunderstanding with Britain, but it would have taken a couple of days, and by that time its mobilization to the east would have been in full swing, and it would have been too late to change mobilization plans for the 3rd time. In our timeline, Germany saw first combat on the 4th of August on the Western Front, only 4 days after the declaration of war, and on the 17th of August in the east, when Russian troops invaded East Prussia. Due to the last-minute change in invasion plans, it would have taken a couple of days longer before they saw first combat, but they would still have mobilized quicker than the Russians. The Russian plan was to concentrate the bulk of their army in southern Poland and invade Austrian Galicia, and use the remainder to take over East Prussia to put pressure on Germany. In our timeline, Russia had numerical superiority in both Galicia and East Prussia, with 1.2 million Russians to 950,000 Austrians in Galicia, and 750,000 Russians to 255,000 Germans in East Prussia. Russia was victorious in Galicia, and by the end of 1914 they occupied almost the entire region. But in East Prussia, it didn't go too well. Russia suffered a humiliating defeat by the Germans, despite outnumbering them 4-1. The Germans and Austrians took advantage of this victory and pushed into southern Poland, occupying about half of Poland. Until May of 1915, the Germans were mostly on the defensive in the east, trying to just hold onto the land that they occupied, while going on the offensive in the west. It was mostly a back and forth, but Russia was slowly retaking Polish territories. The combined German-Austrian armies were constantly outnumbered 2-1, but despite this, they were scoring victory after victory from May 1915 onwards, until the defeat of Russia in 1918. But in this timeline, the combined Austro-German forces would have outnumbered the Russians by over 1 million at the start. The Germans would immediately push from East Prussia towards the Baltics and from central Poland towards Warsaw, achieving both goals by the end of August. Russia would still have most of its troops bordering Galicia preparing for an attack, but because the Russian way of warfare wasn't as flexible, they would have initiated their planned offensive. Because the Russian army did definitely outmatch the Austrian army, they would have seen victories, but there's no way they would have continued their attack with such an overwhelming German force in the north. There was no other option than to divert most of their southern forces to the Baltics and Poland. Russian railways operated on a wider gauge than the German ones, which meant Germany could not have continued their lightning speed offensive indefinitely due to logistical problems, which would have given the Russians time to reorganize their troops and continue mobilization. Germany and Austria would have captured a number of trains in Poland, where there was a high concentration of railroads, but they would still have needed some time to refit their own trains to fit the Russian railways. Until this was done, the Germans could not have used all of their troops, but they would have continued pushing deeper into Poland and Belarus, but with a smaller force and at a slower speed. They would have sent a couple 100,000 troops assisting the Austrians in retaking Galicia. In our timeline, it took the Russians 8 months to deploy 1 million extra troops to the front line, and ironically, they started losing around this time. Even if we suppose the Russians would have mobilized these men in half the time due to the panic caused by the German offensive, they would have been ready at roughly the same time the Germans and Austrians would have fixed their logistical issues. The Austro-German armies would have pushed very deep into Russia, only halting their offensive in winter, likely at the Dnieper in Ukraine and at the gates of Petrograd in the north. In Serbia, the war wouldn't be too different from our timeline. Serbia would be defeated after Bulgaria joins somewhere in 1915. They may join a couple months earlier without Britain and Italy, but the outcome is the same. Serbia capitulates in late 1915. By May of 1916, the climate would be suitable again for a large-scale offensive. Their armies would have been roughly the same size at 3.5 million, but the German forces were much more experienced and organized than new Russian recruits, and thus would have been able to cross the Dnieper and crush the Russian army. Capitalizing on the disorganized retreat of the Russians, they make their way to Volgograd and move south, occupying the Caucasus. The Russians would have prioritized the defense of Petrograd and Moscow. I do think the Russians would have kept fighting for this long, considering it's only 2 years into the war, meaning the people would not have been that exhausted by the war yet, and the Tsar would still have had hope that the British would join the war, or that the French would make a breakthrough into Germany. There's no Russian revolution, at least during the war, and Russia would have fought until the bitter end, but once St. Petersburg is encircled, or Petrograd I should say, and the German army launches a major offensive against Moscow, Russia would have entered peace talks. The threat of famine during the winter of 1916, due to the occupation of most farmlands in the empire, would have led them to sign a very unfavorable and harsh peace treaty. A lot worse than the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. The map looks something like this. Austria annexes Montenegro, but doesn't take land from Serbia. Bulgaria gets North Macedonia and southern Serbia. Romania gets Bessarabia and Odessa. Ukraine and Belarus get liberated and occupy most areas where their respective nationalities are in majority. Estonia is liberated and Livonia is formed out of Lithuania and Latvia, but they are ruled by the ethnic German elite that is subjected to influence from Germany. Finland is liberated and expanded to include areas with big Finno-Ugric populations. Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan get liberated and the country of North Caucasia is formed, consisting of many ethnicities that will be ruled by the Cossack aristocracy. Russia is forced to become a nation-state that is only allowed to rule over ethnic Russians in the European part of the country, but they can keep and expand their Asian territories. A little bit different from the Versailles Treaty in that the aristocracy and Tsar are allowed to keep their positions due to Germany winning the war, they're authoritarian aristocrats. So let's talk about France. Although it is true the French were able to occupy some towns along the border, we should keep in mind that the Germans were focused on a war of movement and thus did not build sophisticated trenches from the start, and once they did, the French advances stopped completely. This alternate Germany has a very different mindset about the Western Front and would have immediately built up their defenses. France mobilized much quicker than Russia, but their war industry was not able to keep up with the huge demand of ammunition, especially artillery shells. Most of the artillery shells used in 1914 were made in Germany, so after the first months of the war, they were forced to limit their artillery use until they were able to produce big amounts of their own. It's not any different in this timeline. If this alternate Germany is able to keep back the French during the initial offensives of 1914, they would be set for the rest of the war, and I do think the Germans would have been able to, not without losing a couple thousand, tens of thousands of men, but I doubt the French would have effectively adapted their tactics to fight in the trenches this early on. Until the Labour government resigns or the British are convinced to join for some other reason, they would limit their involvement to financial and military aid to Russia and France. I believe the British would have joined in the second half of 1916 when Russia is at a breaking point. They would focus mostly on the navy and colonies, blockading the North Sea and the English Channel. Their main objective of joining the war would have been damage control. They had to destroy the German fleet now or deal with a continental superpower in the future that's also eager to challenge British global hegemony. They would have successfully taken over German colonies in Africa, and maybe the Japanese seized this opportunity to conquer German territories in Asia. Germany may try a final Kaiserschlacht against France, probably even invading Belgium, but there is no way it would have worked. After losing hundreds of thousands of men for little gain and losing most of their navy, they would have made peace with France and Britain somewhere in 1917, losing all of their overseas territories and probably sign an agreement to limit the size of their navy. It's likely they in turn demand a demilitarized zone along the French-German border on both sides. No territories are lost in Europe. The final post-war map looks like this.